And welcome to all of you who have turned up bright and early for another show. And I've been looking forward to it. And those of you, if you haven't been on this webinar before, particularly welcome. And we do all hope that you come back. So where we are, it's the four monster stress busters that we've been talking about for the last few weeks, and this is the last one. And the reason why it's last is because I think probably it's the most important, although minute by minute my opinion can change because they're all pretty good. So we started with havening, and if you remember, that's the psychosensory technique, and it can involve stroking your arms, and definitely gets you into a nice calm place. And if you're in a calm place, it's not going to be a stress place, or it's not going to be as stressful. And the second one we talked about was a breathing technique called heart math, which has been around quite a long time now and is very popular, particularly with sports people, but also in schools, and a very simple breathing technique, really in a nutshell. It's just breathing a little deeper than you normally would, and breathing a little slower than you normally would. And some people count to 5 as they're breathing in, and they count to 5 as they're breathing out. But those videos are all on YouTube if you missed them and you want to catch up on with them. And then the third one last week was the bucket of things that I call healing. I believe that we're all healers. I believe that we all have an innate self-healing inside ourselves. As Hippocrates said, it was something like, we all have a doctor inside ourselves. We just have to find it. And the fourth one, which, as I said, is possibly the most important, is hypnosis. And it's also perhaps the most controversial. You'll see and hear so many different views about how it works, if it works, are there any dangers? And we're going to try and address some of those things in the show tonight. And we're going to end with a demonstration, which I invite you to join me in, and we're going to go on a little journey. And obviously, I can't teach you all to be hypnotists in 30 minutes or 40 minutes or however long we have, but I can certainly give you a little start, and I can certainly give you a little prime, and to give you a little bit more reassurance about your own innate hypnotic powers. We're all hypnotists. It's a bit like the healing thing. We sometimes don't know where it's hiding. And the best hypnotists are probably mothers when they are talking to their young children, perhaps even before the children can talk, because their voice automatically adopts a very soothing tone, and no surprise, the troubled child often settles in the mother's arms. I guess the father of modern hypnosis was an American physician called Dr. Milton Erickson, who is dead now, of course, passed on. I don't know very much about his work. Obviously, I've heard about him, but I know that he was a perfectionist. He also was disabled, and he was in a wheelchair. So all of his sessions were conducted up with him, obviously, in a chair. I'm told he had quite a gravelly voice, and I have heard recordings of that. And they're not the kind of voice. It's not the kind of voice that one would normally associate with hypnosis, but certainly seemed to be good enough for him and all the people who studied under him. Hypnosis, in its simplest state, is just like those. There are so many similarities between those three other techniques that I mentioned. It's a technique for facilitating relaxation. And when we relax, our stress levels go down. And when our stress levels go down, we start to connect more to the deeper layers of our mind, and we start to move away from the over-controlling input of the conscious mind. And the more we can connect to the unconscious mind, the easier and more pleasurable our life becomes, because the unconscious mind is hugely, massively larger than the small bit where we live pretty much all the time, most of us. So hypnosis is an altered medical state. And there is a whole spectrum of the depth of hypnosis. It can be very, very shallow. It can be very, very deep. And the scientists have studied people under hypnosis by putting electrodes on them, and just like with meditation, they find this similar kind of alpha wave pattern starting to develop, and sometimes the delta and theta ones, which are even deeper. What is the most important thing to bear in mind about hypnosis? Before I start that, I will say that I've never read a textbook on hypnosis. I've had a lot of training in hypnosis with arguably the two of the best hypnotists in the world. Those are Richard Bandler and Paul McKenna, who some of you will know of. And indeed, Paul McKenna's become a good friend of mine, because I've carried on, my study and my interest in hypnosis and the mind and the power of the mind, and how we can all be work at a much higher level than we give ourselves credit for. But it's an art more than a science. And later during this evening, I'll give you some examples of what I think is the artistry and what I think are the limitations of the scientific approach to hypnosis. But of course, all have their place. And my opinions, by definition, are my opinions. And the great thing is that hypnosis is a broad enough subject that there probably are no wrong and right answers. So the pre-hypnotic induction, every journey starts. I didn't realize what a great mind coach my sports teacher at school was. But when it was raining and I didn't really want to get changed and go out and train for the 5th time that week, he would say, "Come on, get a move on. The only hard bit is putting your boots on." And that's what it was. Put your boots on and you're in the game. You're committed. You're going to do whatever it is, and you'll stop thinking of the 1,000 reasons of why you don't want to do it. And you'll also start to get your head in a better place. And so it is with a pre-hypnotic induction. It is possible to put somebody into hypnosis in a flash, just like that. But it's risky and it's not easy. What is an easier way is to use any technique that starts you on this journey. And there's a lecturer, there's a very good hypnotist who is a senior lecturer, I think, in one of the colleges, one of the main colleges in the UK. And she actually asked me if I'd be interested in joining their faculty as a teacher. And I really liked the idea of that. And I was around in her practices, and she showed me this book, which was this thick. And they were all different pre-hypnotic inductions. And she asked me if I'd read this book, so I had to kind of laugh then. But I flicked through it, and gosh, it just shows there are so many ways to cook the dish. And the purpose of it all is just to bring your wavelength and the client's wavelength into more or less the same place. Now, when somebody says, before I start, I'd like to make a few things clear, or I'd like to give you some housekeeping rules, they probably don't know it, but that is pretty much a pre-hypnotic suggestion. So let me move on now and give you a snapshot of some of the things that I think get in the way of good hypnosis, and some of the things that I think are very helpful. And I'll start with the things that I don't think are that helpful. And one of them is a long pre-hypnotic induction. And by that, I mean, it'll be a long preamble of relaxing every part of the body and slowing your breathing. And it can go on for minutes and minutes and minutes and minutes. Well, it's no surprise that the client starts to close their eyes, because I would, not because I was becoming hypnotized, but because I was becoming a little tired and bored, losing my attention. The other thing is, as I said, it's not an art, it's not a science. So it doesn't help you very much to try and be logical. It doesn't help you to, when you've heard the background to the client's issue, whatever it is, to already be trying to make sense of it all and think, yeah, during this session, this is the target, this is what I want to achieve, this will be my definition of success. Because that kind of thinking is conscious mind thinking. And a conscious mind speaking to another person's conscious mind is not really going to get anywhere, which is why this is where we live most of the time, and why when we share our ideas and things, so often people don't disagree, and they think they're right and the other person's wrong, and vice versa. So conscious mind doesn't help. And if sometimes I'll tell my clients, I say, look, please don't take this personally, but I'm really not interested in your conscious mind at this moment. And I'm not interested in mine either. So I'm not making some terrible personal comment. It's just that the communication that we want to have in this session is unconscious mind to unconscious mind. That's where the power is. I told you that pre-hypnotic suggestions can be pretty complicated, and I was going to say the best example I can give, best isn't the right word, but I was at one of these seminars, I guess, one of these events, and on the main stage there was a hypnotist giving a demonstration, and he was going to hypnotize the whole room, and he was actually reading from a book. He was reading his induction from the book, from his book. So, yeah, really what I'd kind of said before about, can't come from conscious mind. It's another example. Ego is no amigo. Ego will be thinking, how am I doing, Steve? Have I left anything out? What should I be doing now? How can I make this better? I wonder what this other person is thinking. Stuff like that has no place. That will just take you completely to the wrong place in your head. Rapport, body language, even if you don't feel relaxed, try it at least, fake it until you make it. Breathing slowly, talking a little more slowly, they all help. And indeed, you can hypnotize anybody anytime, but it's always best when you've had a little time to prepare yourself, even if it's only 2 or 3 minutes, so that you can do the kind of things we've talked about, go through a quick heart math cycle, do a little bit of self-havening, just do a bit of meditation, a bit of chill. Doesn't do to be too serious. The client is probably taking himself or herself too seriously in the nicest possible way. And the last thing that's going to be helpful for them is if their therapist is also taking himself, herself a bit too seriously. And I think, as I alluded to a little earlier, having a target, having a clearly defined mission. When I go in to see a session, even if it's for the first time, I don't really need to know very much about them, and I don't want to know very much. And I certainly don't have a therapeutic plan in my head. That can be a bit scary, because let's say somebody's with you for 45 minutes and you've got to finish by then, and you're on minute number 43 and you don't feel you've got anywhere. That's the time where you still need to keep calm, because 99 times out of 100, if not more, even if it's that late in the session, the breakthrough will come. So those are the things that are not helpful. And by the way, I don't know whether I forgot to mention this, but I will leave a little bit of room at the end for questions. It will be tricky for me to take questions now as we start to get into this subject. But please do. Greg's keeping a record of stuff, so you can be chatting to him while I'm talking if there's something that you want to get flagged up to me towards the end. Now, what about the things that are helpful? Like I say, if you follow my example in your exams, hypnotherapy exams, chances are you won't pass. And even though you may be a great hypnotist, but it's just not the system, some of the things that I'm going to say. So I go for a short pre-hypnotic induction. My induction can be different every single time. I very often will ask somebody to hold their hands like this, and I'll get them to feel their energy, and I may put my hands in between, and that calms people pretty quickly. I may do a little bit of the havening. I may just tell them a little story. You never guess what happened when in the taxi when I was coming here today, something like that. I may ask them just to do a little deep breathing, whatever, but it's not very long, 30 seconds, maybe a minute at the most. Body language is pretty important. You do have to practice some of these things because naturally all of us are slouchers, but when you're doing work, you should be, sitting pretty big, but comfortable as well. Voice. I often get asked about voice. Voice is very important, and I mentioned that Milton Erickson may not have had the classic hypnotic voice, but certainly somebody like Richard Bandler and particularly Paul McKenna have beautifully calm, restful voices. And Paul has told me really the only thing he thinks about in a session is he likes to think that he's drowning somebody in sound. Drowning, no, he wouldn't use the word drowning, but enveloping them in soothing sound, something like that. Slow talk, slow breathing, as I mentioned, and people project their voice from all different parts of their body, from their lungs, their diaphragm, their throat, their mouth, and throat. All I would say is if you're a bit higher, in the nasal sort of projecting your voice nasally, that probably will go against you. And there are coaches that can help you really, really quickly with that. And on that subject, when I was doing some of my training, there's a machine called an oscilloscope, which you can be hooked up to a microphone. And when you speak into the microphone, you'll get waves, or the waves might be like this, very similar to the waves you get in heart math. And the idea is that you should hit perfect waves. It's not easy to do them backwards. Sinusoidal waves. And I was queuing up, to have my go. I think we were allocated about 5 minutes each on this machine. And I hit a perfect wave as soon as I started. So I ran it for about 10 seconds, and then I gave the microphone back to the trainer. And he said, well, don't you want to practice some more? And I said, well, no, because if I do, I know what's going to happen. I'm going to start overanalyzing this thing, and I'd rather just keep it as it is. The best way to learn the waves is to listen to people who, as I've mentioned, have them. And, David Attenborough is another one that you see on television. I don't know whether he's ever anybody's told him he's a hypnotist, but he is, or he certainly has the voice of a hypnotist. Things that can work. Now, what about the content? What are you going to talk about with this client in front of you? This is when you have to be a creator, because I've already mentioned, scripts don't work. And so we all like stories, and we have to weave a little magic with our story. And I find that fairy stories are good. I mean, you don't tell somebody a fairy story, but you follow that kind of language. I mean, all fairy stories begin, once upon a time, there was a beautiful princess, and they all end, and they all lived happily ever. Hopefully the little child's sleeping by then. Hopefully you won't be. You've got to be a little careful with what they call presuppositions, because I could say to you, I know that as every second goes by, you're becoming more and more relaxed. And hopefully I'd be right. But if I'm not, then that's going to be sort of an alarm bell in the other person. How does he know that I'm getting more and more relaxed? Actually, I'm getting more and more tense because I'm thinking about what I came in with. The unconscious mind loves ambiguity. The unconscious mind doesn't really greatly value words. It deals in emotions and feelings. Words came very late in our evolution as human beings. But the kind of words that it does like is ambiguous words. It likes ambiguity because it can immediately recognize that, oh, wow, this can mean 3 or 4 different things. And it likes special kind of stories, stories that start in one place and seem to go on a bit of a journey. And you think this person's forgotten what the end of the story is, and because he's moved on to something else. And Richard Bandler is a king at this, and he will always close the story, which sort of rams home the point that he was floating earlier on. And those are called embedded loops, but it takes a bit of practice to get those right. So we're speaking to the unconscious mind rather than the conscious, as I mentioned, and recognizing that the unconscious mind likes feelings. It particularly likes building visualizations, and that's why it's best with the person's eyes closed, because more and more of those cells that are normally working on developing visual images can work on developing imaginary images. And a bit of humor, again, has to be used carefully in the right place. And a good example of that is I was on a training on a course, and there was a lady there who was a high court judge. And she looked exactly what you would imagine. She was very strong, and you knew that if you said something she didn't like, you would know about it. And I'm not sure that she particularly wanted to be a hypnotist, but she was on a course which we call neuro-linguistic programming, which I'm sure we'll talk about on one of these shows. And she wanted to learn about that because it's great for improving communication. But because she was on this course, she had to have a certain exposure to hypnosis. And she came to me because she was having difficulty with it. So I sat down with her, and we were in a fairly crowded room. And so I said, okay, well, let's see. Let me just try and see if I can get you into a slightly altered state, and we'll see what happens. And I tried. I'll say I started. And I could see I wasn't really getting anywhere. I could see the furrowed brow, because this lady, she just couldn't let go. She's obviously a very intelligent, analytical type person, and she was probably trying to analyze everything that I was going to say. So I kept her eyes open. I said, I'm going to read you a fairy story. I'm quite sure that your parents read you fairy stories, and I'm going to make sure that you're right in the middle of this story. And you're going to be, of course, the beautiful princess. And did you say your name was Angela? He said, yes. She probably said her name was Judge so-and-so. So I said, okay, well, Angela's going to be the beautiful princess. And I can't remember exactly what story I told her. But towards the end, I said, and Ange was so happy because she'd met the perfect princess and had ridden off into the sunlight to have a wonderful life. Angie baby. And she started laughing. So it worked. And by then, it was easy, And when we finished, she said, well, don't think anybody's spoken to me like that for a long time, but I also can't remember being so relaxed for a long time. So I guess I just about got away with it. I hope our paths don't cross again too soon, in case she remembers. So that's my take on what works in hypnosis, what doesn't. Health and safety warning, by the way, never try these techniques, even on yourself, unless you're in a very safe place. And certainly, I'm about to go and move on to a demo later on in a few minutes' time. And if you're driving a car at the moment, and I hope you're not, if you're operating machinery, I hope you're not, but on the unlikely event you're doing any of these things, please stop. That's the health and safety warning. Why is it useful to know a little bit about hypnosis? Well, I've mentioned that we're all hypnotists, and every single day you are going to be subject to hypnotic inductions of one kind or another. The people who are really, really good at this are some educators. I've mentioned David Attenborough is an obvious example. Some politicians, because they're either really good at this kind of stuff or they've been trained and they have all the language patterns and everything else. And the people who definitely are very professional at it are the advertisers, the top marketing people. And so if somebody's selling you something, particularly if it's expensive, the chances are it's going to be hypnotic. And I immediately think of these wonderful car adverts we see. They've got it all. They've got the beautiful man, the beautiful woman, the beautiful little girls, the little girl, little boy sitting in the back seat. And in between, of course, there's the beautiful dog. So what they're really doing is they're selling the classic dream, which means you buy this car and that person there is going to be you. We wish. Right. Now, I did have a couple of comments from people when they registered for the show, and I'm going to read one of them out because I asked people a question, and my question was, when you work with clients, how and when do you know your subject is in trance? Could you describe it to me, please, in your own words? And this lady wrote in to me, and actually, I really enjoy reading what she wrote, and I'm going to share it with you now. By having awareness of my delivery of words in terms of content, speed, timbre, that's a good word, I hope I pronounced it right, I observe my client's response. He begins to mirror me when speaking. Yeah, mirroring is very important. I forgot to mention that. Physical signs are relaxing of the shoulder, neck, and jaw. Yeah, that's what we're trying to do. A slower and deeper breathing pattern, a change in the skin tone, and observing a fluttering of the eyelids when eyes are closed. That's true. You can just see them. So thank you for that comment. That was very kind of you to spend some time telling me about that. And then the other comment was from somebody who's been on these shows before, which may have been on every one for all I know, and that is Angela. So Angela, I hope you're there, and if you can unmute yourself and speak to me, please.
I can speak.
We've got off to a good start. So Angela, I said I had a question or two for you. Perhaps the first question would be, I've just read out one lady's experience as a hypnotherapist, what she observes of her client. And I wonder whether that's similar to your experience, or perhaps you hear, feel things in a different way.
Absolutely not. She's got it. It's kind of a subconscious, once you get used to the process.
Yeah.
I'm not as conscious of it. I just am aware when they're in the zone. Yeah,
that's right. And that's what I feel. It's a hard thing to put into words, but well, there's one thing that a lot of the people, my peers, that when we get together and we talk about these things, they say, when we have these conversations, they say, you have to go there first. And as I mentioned, if you can chill for 5 minutes before the session, that's going to help, because your aim is to get the client to mirror with you. If you're calm, you want the client to be calm as well. So yeah, I think we're all saying the same kind of thing here. And the other question I was going to ask you, I've been a hypnotherapist heretic now with some of the good and bad things that I've said from my list. But I wondered if would you disagree strongly with anything that I said, or on the other side, were the things that resonated very strongly with you?
I wouldn't disagree. I loved that we're all hypnotists, and that generally we run around in a trance state all the time. The majority of our behaviors are trance states by necessity. If you had to consciously think about every single thing that you did, you would never get anything done. You wouldn't even be able to tie your own shoes, just because it would just overwhelm the system. And so we have to have the majority, like you said, that vast area has to be those trance states. And those are what we want to change with hypnosis.
Yeah, that's beautifully expressed, Angela, and you're absolutely right. I mean, I probably hardly ever mention hypnosis with my clients, but I definitely talk a lot about, living in the now, being in the moment, because when people are, overthinking the future and the past, no wonder they get headaches, and no wonder they find life very stressful and tiring. So, absolutely. I do have time for one quick question right now before I start the next bit. If there's anybody who would like to, not even a question, a comment, how are we getting on so far?
Yes, there is one question from Donna. Do you
Okay,
want me
Donna?
to read it out, or maybe Donna, you can ask it yourself if you want.
Sure, I'm happy to read it out. Hi, Stephen.
Hello.
It's a pleasure to meet you again. I just wrote in the chat pod that we met in 2017 at the Richard Bandler and Paul McKenna, The Best You. Yeah, I highly doubt that you're going to remember me, but a long time ago. But it's a pleasure to see these webinars, and your voice is, as you said, very hypnotic. So well done, and thanks for these. My question is that I would like to run by you is you mentioned earlier that David Attenborough has a hypnotic conducive voice, and I wondered if you would know of a female public figure which would have the same wave in their voice, so as a lady I could listen out for this in their tone, which would be an effective measure for my own voice.
Well, there certainly are plenty. Now, as a public figure, one is not immediately coming to mind, but I know it will. As soon as the show is over, it'll come to me. So if you send me an email afterwards, I'll put more thought to it. But I can give you a very good example of somebody who's like semi-public figure, and that is a singer-songwriter called Vashti. She was around at the time, the early sort of pop scene, and she was a friend of the Beatles and people like that, Marianne Faithfull, and she actually recorded her own debut album because she was probably encouraged to by the people she was mixing with, and the first review that it got, she was slated, and she went to pieces, and she basically left London. Literally, she had a horse and a cart, and I think she spent the years traveling around and settling on the Scottish Islands and stuff like that. And finally, she ended up in Canada with a family many years later, not so long ago. And she was in a Canadian store, and she heard her music being played, and it was actually a #1 album in Canada and probably other parts of the world, but she'd never heard about it. Anyway, she went on, and she was asked to, one of her songs from that debut album was taken by Vodafone for their adverts. I think it's, I can't remember the name of it now. I was going to sing it to you, but I won't. But anyway, when I heard this lady talking and singing, really, really hypnotic. So there's one for you, Vashti, Vashti.
Excellent. I've looked it up there now. Thanks, Stephen.
Okay, thank you. Okay, now I invite you to come with me on a little journey. And because of everything that I've said so far, this is unplanned. So not for the first time in my life, I'm going to say, trust me, I'm a doctor. And I'll be talking to you, and I'll be in my unconscious mind. We'll be setting up with your unconscious mind, and neither of us knows what kind of conclusions we're going to draw from this. I said that it's not a good thing to be directive, and here I am, I'm being slightly directive. We could do this exercise with an open mind and with nothing other than that, but I mean, let's do that, but also think of something that is a a bit of something that you can't get your head around at the moment. Something's not quite right, but you can't put your finger on what it might be, or you can't figure a way around a particular issue in your life. And let's see if the unconscious mind will sort of play with that. And we're going to when somebody says, before we start, here's a few things. Well, if you see a stage hypnotist, the hypnosis will have started probably before the person in the audience has got out of their chair. They all think it starts on the stage. That's where it usually ends, after a few minutes. Now, we've got to get away a little bit, I think, from the ego that is not our amigo. So I invite you to close your eyes. You don't have to. You can keep your eyes open. It's a personal choice. And we're going to go on a journey. Athletes and professional sports people and musicians and things, they talk about being in the zone. And some of them talk about being in the bubble. And I guess they call it the bubble because it is a reality, but it's different from real life. It's quieter. There's still sound there, but it's a bit sort of muffled. And they can get into their bubble. They've learned the techniques. So I invite you now, you have a bubble inside you. You have a bubble that's wanting to come out. So let your bubble come out and surround you. And one of the other lovely things about this bubble is it makes you feel very light on your feet. And people say, I've got so much baggage I'm carrying. My shoulders are so heavy. I'm so bowed. But when you're inside this little bubble, because your feet are floating, then so is everything else. And it's as if there is no gravity. We've all seen those lucky people who are up on the space shuttle, and they're weightless. And they tell me that it's the best experience of life to be weightless. And you see them playing around in the space shuttle. Well, inside your bubble, you're weightless. And it makes life a little easier. And what's going to make life a little easier is if we just allow our bubble to take us in the direction of the space station, perhaps. You don't need to go all that way up, but at least have the perspective that you're on the top of a mountain or you're in some high place where people always go to connect with spirituality, to connect with themselves, to connect with what in the next program we're going to call infinite intelligence. So when we look around inside our bubble and we're looking down, when we look down, we recognize from a height, we recognize how small everything is down there. It's an instinct that we try and find the places on our planet. This is where I live. This is where I was born. So that's fair enough. But they're small, even though they're important to us. And some of the things in our life are very important to us. And some of them in our life are very important for reasons that are not so important. These are the things that we worry about, that we worry a lot about sometimes. And we think if ever this problem goes away, I'll never complain about anything ever again. Well, the truth is that if that was the truth, it wouldn't be the truth. Because we know it seems to be the cycle of life that as one problem surfaces and fades away, another problem will raise its head. It's just like the tide. Tide comes in, the tide goes out. But when we look down at these same problems that we've been worrying about from a height, the problems are smaller. The problems are not so easy to see because they're smaller. The problems do not have that strong emotion attached to them. because they're further away. When we're on the earth, these problems are literally right in front of our eyes or right behind our eyes, but not when we're up here. And when we can put some distance, literally, between here and there, we become more relaxed. And when we become more relaxed, we become more balanced in our unconscious mind. And we begin to be more intuitive. But it's not quite like that either. You see, we're always intuitive. We're always intuitive. But things get in the way of that intuition. And the people who've been to space, they know that. They talk about how they feel separated from their problems when they're up there. And a lot of them don't want to come back, but they have to sooner or later. When they do come back, because they've seen those important issues that felt so important at the time, they feel differently about them. So that's why putting a little space, that's an ambiguous word, helps us to see things in a different perspective, the same things in a different perspective. And the things that we want to think more about, when we look down, are those great things we had, those great experiences, those great people we met, and also, in our own modesty, the times when we were happy because we did some pretty good stuff too. Those are the things that are worth thinking about and hanging on to. So when you come back down to planet Earth again, after this very short little circuit around the universe, you'll recognize, we all will recognize, we're only a little grain of sand. A little grain of sand might get blown around by the wind and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, a grain of sand is the sand. Just like we are a miracle of nature, a miracle of creation, and miracle of evolution. And it's taken us millions of years to get there. So we are equipped to deal with this kind of stuff. Right, bubble, bubble, back to Earth. Starting to feel the gravity again. Starting to wake up a little more. Starting to see and feel, and yeah, I'm familiar with where this place is. How do you feel about this place? How do you feel about yourself? How's it going to make you feel tomorrow? Maybe every day after that? What kind of new thinking might be forming those neural networks as you sleep and as you dream this evening? Because if you can change your thinking about one thing, you can change it about more things. One thing's for certain, if your thinking stays the same, nothing will change. Most people want to change something or move somewhere a little different. As Einstein said, the definition of insanity is when you try and do the same thing every time, hoping for a different result. And there's another good saying, which kind of will probably segue me into our next show on on infinite intelligence. And that's about luck, which is a subject that fascinates me, and I've written books and articles on it. And it's Carl Jung. Synchronicity is an ever-present reality for those who have eyes to see. So, deep breath. I hope you enjoyed the journey. How was that? Somebody liked it. Several people liked it.
It was lovely. Thank you.
You're welcome. And I've got a wave from Johnny. I think, Johnny, hopefully you liked it. Right. Different mustard. Yeah, I've heard that comment before. Still don't know what it means, but I like mustard, so I'm taking it as a compliment. Compliment. I think that's, oh yeah, I did want to say one other thing. Thank you, Dana, very relaxing. This is not an advertisement, but I know that it sounds like it. I made an audio book 10 years ago called Zen Hypnosis Confidence. And it was sold on iTunes. It was the first audio book I ever made. And it had a really bad but it ended up number one on iTunes. Okay. For well over a year. And that's in any category. So people like Dan Brown, they sold more than the Da Vinci Code. So that is on my website. It's priced at $4.99 in my shop. But if, I know times are difficult at the moment, if you haven't got $4.99, send me an email and I'll send it to you for free. But if you're interested in hypnosis, I haven't listened to it for years. All I know is that it sold thousands and thousands of copies, and I had loads of good feedback from it. So sometimes, you know, I know people who just listen to this once a day when they're going to bed or they're doing something, who knows, but they seem to like it. Right. Any questions, anybody?
Sorry, what was that book called, please, Stephen?
It was called Zen Hypnosis Confidence.
Thank you.
Which is a really clunky title, which the publishers hated, but I dug my heels in stubbornly, and they thought stupidly, and I didn't know. Any other questions?
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was wishing I would have recorded that little bit you just did. I would love to just do that again. So
Yeah.
Are there similar things in the book?
It's a 23-minute, it's basically what we'd call a guided meditation. So something will be similar, but the good news for you is that it is recorded. This thing will be recorded, and I get an audio file and I get a video file, and they'll both be published. The video will go on YouTube, and the audio thing will probably be a podcast. So all of you will be able to download today's session.
I really enjoyed that little journey.
Thank you. Okay, well, I think that's enough for now. You have your evenings to get onto, although I know some of you are from different parts of the world. I do hope we'll meet again next week. In the meantime, stay well. Live in trance at least a little, and be lucky. Bye-bye.